feel this honor very much too. Thank you very much for the invitation, for the wonderful atmosphere here, and thank you, Hubert Burda, for your introduction to my lecture. I have changed the title a little bit. It names now selfies as a universal language, but I'm not a thesis, but a question. And I was impressed how much we discussed on selfies yesterday and today, and how much enthusiasm was to come with this topic. And I think it's astonishing because it's quite a new thing. Selfies 3 years ago, most of us heard the first time this word, and in this short time, it has got a quite controversial term and is discussed with great enthusiasm from opponents as well as from advocates. And for example, in this year are about half of a dozen of exhibitions that deal with selfies, and a lot of conferences which deal only with selfies. I agree with Ian McEwan that perhaps here a little bit too much cultural pessimism has dominated the discussion yesterday and today, and I would like to try to take another position in my lecture. I think I can continue some of the remarks you made yesterday and today in the discussion. I hope I can pick up some of the issues of the panel discussion earlier in the day today, especially the concept of instant communication is important for me. Well, we have not only the opponents of selfies, we have as well advocates who are quite enthusiastic and one-dimensional perhaps in their view of the topic. For example, the well-known US-American art critic Jerry Saltz stated some months ago that reality TV star Kim Kardashian is the new Andy Warhol with her book Selfish, a book that is a collection of selfies of Kardashian of the last 10 years. And he says in an article that she is connecting, I quote Jerry Saltz, grandiosity, sincerity, kitsch, irony, theater, and ideas of spectacle, privacy, fact, and fiction in a new manner, and all that had compressed into some new essence, and that's the reason for him to say she is the Andy Warhol of nowadays. That's the opposite position to the position we had here in the room yesterday and today. And but I think that both these meanings or both these positions, perhaps omit one dimension of the topic that seems very important to me. Generally, I think one aspect of this phenomenon often remains strangely unreflected. Nobody seems to be surprised by the fact that selfies got so popular only a few years ago. Also, they would have been possible already in the whole history of photography. Some interprets look at photographic self-portraits as a precursor of selfies, but I think this blurs the striking fact that today no longer only artists and aesthetically ambitious people take photographs from themselves. Rather, it has become a mass movement to make selfies. By the way, the speed of this development weakens, I think, all culture critiques who interpret selfies as a sign of great social or mental change, because such changes take place only slowly and within generations, not within a couple of years. Indeed, it's not difficult to find an answer why the selfie boom hasn't originated it much earlier. For example, after the introduction of roll film cameras or in the course of the Polaroid boom in the 1970s. The relevant difference between the earlier kinds of photography and the smartphone lies in the fact that now it has become possible to make pictures not only on an instant, but also to dispatch them in the same moment to a friend or to the big community of World Wide Web. That was a point you mentioned yesterday, and I think you quoted Andy Warhol with his famous sentence, images need to be shared. And I think this sentence never has been better fulfilled than since 2007, when the smartphone started to conquer the market. And the important issue, I think, is the following. These pictures, these photographs have become means of communication, of live or of instant communication. With a smartphone photograph in general, or with a selfie especially, you can inform others where you are, how you are, what you are doing. And often you can do so quicker, you can do so wittier, with more subtlety, with more emotion, than if you would use words. One picture says more than 1,000 words. That is, the selfie boom is closely attached to a function of pictures which has originated only from smartphones, the function of life of instant communication. Before the era of smartphones, before the era of social media, one never could use pictures in the same way like words, as a medium to exchange news, opinions, feelings at every moment. That's a famous iconic term. Hubert Boda was one of the first to realize this movement, this historical change, and organized a lot of important lectures in Munich 10 years ago. Pictures might already have owned the character of signals or of messages in former times. Or they could express mood or intensify this mood, but one could not communicate instantly with them. And in addition to this, the production of pictures took too much time to communicate with them. Put into consideration a picture that was produced with a lot of effort should permanently fix its motive, otherwise it would have been senseless, too much work, inefficient. Therefore, a picture had to be a document, a souvenir, it had to be a lot of meaning, or it should be an occasion for reflection, or as the ancient Greeks say, ktema esae, something that should go over the moment and over the times. Julian Spalding, you showed us the famous Dürer Selbstportrait yesterday. Dürer, it took him about 3 months to paint this picture. And it's clear, if you spend such a lot of time, then you want something with the thing. And it's not, there is a lot of intention with it and a lot of meaning with it. And that's, you can say in general, for the history of art or for the history of the self-portrait. It was important for the artists to put in scene their role as an artist, to increase their glory with the pictures. It should be a long-lasting work, it should be a manifestation and so on. Dürer, for example, he furnished his customers a guarantee for 500 years. He was convinced that his work will be meaningful in 500 years. And it will be is painted so good that it can be conserved for such a long time. That was this paradigm of pictures before smartphones came, and another function of pictures got possible: pictures to use for instant communication. Well. If you keep this in mind, I think it's possible to explain selfies in her special qualities too, and to separate them clearly from other pictures which have to fulfill other traditional functions. It's often noted and mostly criticized that many people present themselves with distorted, grimace-like faces on selfies. Roger Scruton, you did it too in your lecture. One example, that's an American wrestler here. And yes, especially many intellectuals assume that this is a sign of superficiality, stupidity, or lacking social competence, all these distorted faces on selfies. However, I think that we overlook that selfies almost always rise in a certain communicative situation. And in this situation, they should be unequivocal, they should be succinct, they should perhaps be so impulsive that they bring other people to a direct reaction. The person who takes a selfie wants to show, wants to demonstrate something to somebody. And insofar, selfies have similar properties as other kinds of pictures that play a role in social media. And especially, I think, they are very well comparable with emoticons and emojis. You know, emoticons shall express various feelings, shall codify standard situations of communication, so that one can transmit a personal status faster than with words. And in the same way, the strong expressions of selfies are to interpret as signs. They are like pictograms. They are striking. They are a more and more codified way to express some feelings. The recipients of the selfies recognize the far-torn open eyes or the sticked-out tongues or the broadly smiling mouths in their meaning immediately. Besides, the expressive quality often can and should work contagious. Others get into the same mood in which those are already which send a selfie. The fact that selfies own a similar function like emoticons led in last year already to the development of own app, the app Emoji. And here you can, with graphic means, change the backgrounds or the remove details or elements of the face, and so makes a selfie to an emoticon more or less. Another interesting phenomenon you can especially find on Instagram, a lot of tableaus with selfies on which you can see the actors not only in different 4, 6, 9 poses, but on which also the corresponding emoticon is installed in the picture. And I think here it gets clear that emoticons are the given reference, and one tries to adapt oneself to them. There's an unspoken competition for the most concisely sharpened poses, most striking in their expression. And it's a matter of surprising others by a selfie and of maintaining as well as of experiencing a moment quite emotionally, even stronger and more intensely in itself by a selfie. The success of instant apps like Snapchat or Periscope, which do not store that what is posted, shows how fascinating it's for people to use pictures just for a strong moment. Pictures in the social media disappear immediately as spoken words. Perhaps they live on in the memory of some people, but physically they are no longer existent. And just a large part of the material which remains visible on social media platforms like Facebook or Tumblr is never looked again, but loses itself in the depths of sites with infinite scroll function. That's a metaphysical phenomenon of nowadays, infinite scroll. Well, a selfie which has originated from a current mood has already, after the shortest time, as little importance as an old shopping list. And only in special cases one will see a valuable document in a selfie. Perhaps an artist or a cultural scientist could have the idea to collect the preserved material to make something else with it. However, selfies are for those which are actively or passively, who are involved actively or passively with them. Selfies are full of consequences. So we can observe that selfies, in her functional resemblance to emoticons and influenced by them, change parts of the body language and the facial expression. The more often one takes a typical selfie pose to show others what's going on, and the more often one is confronted with countless selfies of his friends or other people, the more clearly certain gestures and grimaces develop. As high mimetic beings with always active mirror neurons, people adopt the strongest and most suggestive forms of expression. Really, there might be nothing else in the present culture which modifies as effectively as selfies and emoticons the codification of facial features and gestures. Additionally, you should take into consideration when they take selfies, people are more conscious and more concentrated with respect to their mimic expression than in most other situations of their social life. Hence, meanwhile, you find typical facial gestures of selfies also beyond them. I will give you an example. We'll show you a still of an advertising video with the title "Things Everybody Does But Doesn't Talk About," which was President Barack Obama published in February in this year. When this year, in the video, the putatively unobserved president, while he prepares a speech before the mirror, but also horses around and smirks. Over and over again, he presents facial features which remind of typical selfie poses and have at the same time an unequivocal antitype in emoticons. For example, here, Obama looks himself in the mirror in the codified pose, face with struck out tongue and winking eye. Later on in this video, he handles with a selfie stick and makes selfies of himself. However, whether he is shown while taking a selfie or while preparing his speech makes in the end no difference. The striking facial features of selfies and emoticons have already stamped his whole body language. The US-American artist Jenna E. Garrett has begun in 2014 to collect some of the gestures and expressions which are particularly put in scene on selfies and can hence be estimated as codes valid of communication. Here's one tableau of her, of a lot of tableaus, and each tableau is deals with one selfie gesture. There are some are older gestures like the victory sign, but others have their origins in selfies. The fact that such poses could prevail within a few years testifies, I think, to the formative power of selfies. And this power is even more impressive if you consider that selfies are a global phenomenon. Sam, you told us today that your experience in Spain, I think, Japan, excuse me, other culture, but same conventions concerning selfies. And you could name other countries, other cultures too. That means what is successful in one country or society influences at the same time behavior patterns in other regions of the world. Like emoticons, selfies are about to become a universal language with which moods and situations get communicated everywhere in the same way. Cultural differences concerning the meaning of single gestures and expressions get less relevant. After many vain attempts of a universally valid form of communication, now a universal language is developed for the first time in the history of humanity, without intention to do so. That's the difference to former trials to do so. For example, the isotypes of Otto Neurath and so on, attempts to establish a universal language. And this language may be still very rudimental, that's clear, but maybe it creates bit by bit the base for more complicated manners of transcultural understanding. If selfies on the one hand help to revive old utopias of a communication without any borders, they lead on the other hand to more standardized stamping of facial features and gesture. Especially selfies show extreme and strange poses, which define the field of possible feelings in the sum, determine it from the edges, from its most striking phenomena. If one continued the work of Garrett strictly and tried to grasp all expressions propagated with selfies, there would arise, again in analogy to emoticons, a kind of alphabet. It would consist in the modifications which can be carried out with single facial parts like lips, chin, eyes, or eyebrows. These are combined differently with each other in each case. If one sees one's far-opened mouth with closed eyes, the same mouth is combined with opened eyes or a forehead laid in folds in another constellation. And this commemorates a quite interesting project of former days, of an artist from the 18th century, Franz Xaver Messerschmitt, and his so-called Charakterköpfe, heads of character. In the years after 1770, Messerschmitt developed about 50 sculptures and busts, by the way, oriented in his own physiognomy, to play through what different and in her extremes caricature-like facial features are possible. I'll show you here a lithograph of Matthias Thoma, where he arranges a number of these busts of Messerschmitt. And I think we can see the similarities to facial patterns of self. Furthermore, Messerschmitt found combinations for which there is not yet a counterpart in the era of selfies, but perhaps it will come. However, selfies give Messerschmitt's often misunderstood work a new impact. They make clear what may have been his interest: to constitute a kind of language with the possibilities of physiognomy alone. He was an early utopist concerning the idea of a universal language based on physiognomy. And nowadays, this project of Messerschmitt gets fulfilled. What seemed only strange and esoteric for a long time, all these facial features have become a medium of a global communication. I wanted to close with that. However, the long-lasting discussion yesterday about Dürer, initiated by Julian Spotling led me to the idea to show you another work of Dürer, another, well, I would not say self-portrait, I would not say selfie, but more selfies than self-portrait. I just want to show you that Dürer can be seen in one, concerning one sketching as a precursor of the selfie culture. This one here, I don't know if you know, sketching watercolor and from 1526, 2 years before Dürer died. And this picture was a kind of letter, and he sent it to a doctor. And he wrote, I read in German first, da der gelbe Fleck ist und mit dem Finger drauf, da ist mir weh. So there where the yellow spot is, and when I press the finger on it, it hurts. Well, they wanted to have, to show, to demonstrate, and it was a first trial of instant communication with his doctor, who was in another town than Dürer was. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this interesting remarks. So I'm looking to the watch. 10 minutes time. Yeah. That means 2-3 questions before we start. You probably think about what is Mr. Burda's interest in smileys and selfies, and I think he's quite a cultivated man and so on. I tell you why. I tell you why. It's quite simple. Google took away all the advertising business for newspapers, and if you go to the newsstands here, you find newspapers, yeah, very thin, magazines very thin. The journalists are looking who's going to pay for them. The whole traditional media is in crisis. And me, for instance, I was very early stage with the two boys, Sergey Brin and Larry Page, they were friends of mine 15 years ago. Yeah, 15 years ago. And they rovinated the newspaper, and a lot. And if Murdoch paid $2 billion, he paid $5 billion for the Wall Street Journal, it was probably too much. As you could see, that the Financial Times was about 1.5 million. And now there's a new language coming. This language has been on search engine and the distribution through search results in advertising. And we slept. All publishers slept. And now is a new language there, iconic turn. It's not so much aesthetically hurting me, but you send your picture of yourself and you say, hey, that's me. In German, ich komme vor. I'm someone. You get a reply of someone said, oh, that's interesting. You are in Venice. I haven't known that you are in Venice. Tell me, what are you doing? What are you going to eat? Where are you going? Which airline are you taking? And people are sending out data. And this is a business. The business is to collect this data. And of course, Facebook comes up and put advertisement in it. For the moment being, some people are angry about too much advertising. But Facebook and Snapchats and Pinterest is young Mr. Osborne here. He told me that Martin Sorrell, who has the biggest advertising agency, he told me that Pinterest is the best for advertising people. So, I mean, it's aesthetically, it's a little bit like Thomas Mann getting the first telephone in 1905, and someone was ringing, he don't know what to say. And then he said to his wife, how can you get someone put in my room before asking the secretary? I mean, how can he step directly in my room? So can you imagine what stuff he said on the telephone? And so this is a little bit the same with the selfies, but this communication, this iconic turn communication, will not go away. And it will be a universal language. We have seen about, smiling. But as you came up with Dürer, can you imagine how much our medical information system will change now with these new possibilities? This was too long. I excuse myself, but a media man is always, two questions of people who are total other opinion.
If it's okay if I start simply because I have the microphone. Thank you very much, Wolfgang. I think that's wonderful. I have a question that I think that it's very easy to be sort of pessimistic when it comes to these things, and you talk about a certain narcissism when it comes to the culture of the selfie and things like that. The question I have is that perhaps it's simply a question of perspective. Is that when you see someone post something, whether it's your Facebook wall, your Instagram post, your Twitter feed, and you interpret it in a sort of cult of narcissism, perhaps you read too much into it. And perhaps the real question is, who is the intended audience? Perhaps you are not the intended audience. And so the question is, perhaps we're accusing people of narcissism too much precisely because we're assuming that people are targeting you, whereas they could be targeting anyone. You're not necessarily the target of a particular post or a picture. You're not necessarily the intended audience. So in that respect, perhaps it's not so much a cult of narcissism as a cult of sort of self-expression and putting yourself out there and seeing who, waiting for the audience to simply have the culture of supply and demand. And by assuming that you are the person who's being targeted, that's why you interpret narcissism in other people, perhaps.
Well, thank you. I think the problem may be that often we look at these pictures if we deal in an academic context, we look at them and decontextualize them. We see the picture and the grimace and or the smile and say, oh, how narcissistic or how superficial and so on. But if we would see it in the context where it is sent and addressed and seen, then perhaps we had another opinion of the same picture. And therefore, I think it's very important to always to have in mind the whole situation where these pictures occur and have a function. And I think then the both extreme positions, the culture pessimism on the one side and the enthusiastic on the other side, who say that's a new art, are a little bit dimmed down. And this was my aim with the lecture, to try to find another view for this topic, and besides these two extreme positions.
Okay, so just maybe one last question by my humble self. So because you posited selfies as a universal language, let me just philosophize language again, and of course bring in the person who in the 20th century was the main proponent of, philosophy of languages, was Wittgenstein, and his famous argument about private language. There isn't such a thing as private language, effectively, and that language can only be language if it's shared. And whether calling the selfies a language or form of language has the same sort of properties as, the Wittgensteinian description of language, in the sense in which a selfie is by definition something shareable. Whether there isn't such a thing as a private selfie, whether the intention of taking a selfie includes the idea that there's going to be something shared or something in principle shareable.
Yeah, well, the discussion goes back until the Renaissance, and what you mentioned, Wittgenstein, and later on Wiener Kreis and Neurath, I mentioned shortly, is not the first important state of the discussion. In the Renaissance, for example, Leonardo and his colleagues discussed the question if pictures are a natural language, a language that you have not to learn, and if this could be a base to establish anything as a universal language. However, the point of universal language was more in the interest in the 20th century then, and I think especially Otto Neurath really was very reflected with his attempts of isotypes, and he was engaged later on from the Communist Party in Soviet Union, and the Pravda was published once a week in isotypes. And this was an attempt to establish a universal language, or a language which could be understood by analphabets too, and but it failed. And afterwards we can analyze the reasons why it had to fail. And therefore I think it's interesting. I overdressed this point now, and I would, you have seen at the beginning, I made the question mark. But I see it is on the way to something like that as a universal language. I do not believe that it will ever, we will get rid of spoken words and only communicate with pictures or with selfies. But as a Morse alphabet, it may, we may become, we may have a selfie alphabet some days, perhaps.
Thank you very much.
We can continue the discussion.